When we begin talking about spiritual deception, one of the first things we have to understand is that words are never neutral. Human beings live inside language. The words we speak, the phrases we repeat, and the songs we sing are not merely sounds drifting through the air. They are structures that shape the way we perceive reality. In the biblical worldview, words are creative forces. In the opening lines of Scripture, God speaks the world into existence. That alone tells you something profound. Speech is not trivial. It forms worlds. Now, if that is true, and psychologically speaking, it absolutely is, then the words that repeatedly occupy our minds have enormous influence over our attitudes, our emotions, and even our sense of identity. Modern psychology has caught up to this idea in many ways. What you rehearse internally becomes your internal narrative, and your internal narrative becomes the lens through which you interpret life. If you constantly repeat messages of defeat, fear, resentment, or hopelessness, those ideas gradually reorganize your perception of reality. That is precisely why the enemy works so subtly through language. The devil rarely confronts believers with something obviously evil. That would be too easy to reject. Instead, deception often enters through ideas that seem harmless, emotional, or even comforting. A song can be beautiful musically. It can stir deep feelings. But if the message embedded in it reinforces despair rather than faith, victimhood rather than trust in God, then something dangerous is happening beneath the surface. And here's the psychological problem. Repetition builds belief. The human brain is wired in such a way that the more often we hear something, the more familiar it becomes, and the more likely we are to accept it as truth. It's one of the most powerful cognitive biases we possess. If a message is repeated frequently enough in music, in media, or even in casual conversation, it begins to feel natural. It becomes part of the background noise of life. And once that happens, people stop questioning it. This is why worship matters so deeply. When Christians sing, they are not merely expressing emotion, they are reinforcing theology. Every line that is sung becomes a statement about God, about human nature, and about the nature of hope. Songs are powerful because they bypass the analytical mind and go directly into memory and emotion. That's why people can remember lyrics from songs they heard 20 years ago, even if they cannot remember what they had for breakfast yesterday. Music embeds ideas into the soul. So if a believer continually sings messages that emphasize defeat, helplessness, or constant despair, those ideas slowly begin to shape the spiritual imagination. Over time, faith becomes fragile. God begins to feel distant. Life begins to look darker than it actually is. And the tragedy is that the person may never realize why this shift has happened, because the influence came quietly through repetition. Now think about the contrast that Scripture presents. Biblical worship is filled with declarations of God's strength, His faithfulness, His sovereignty, and His ability to redeem even the darkest circumstances. When believers sang in the Psalms, they were not simply describing their problems. They were reorienting their perspective toward the character of God. And that distinction is crucial. There is nothing wrong with expressing pain or struggle. In fact, honesty before God is essential. But the biblical pattern always moves from despair toward trust. It begins with struggle, but it ends with faith. The message ultimately lifts the mind upward, reminding the believer that God is still sovereign over chaos. That movement from fear to faith is what protects the human spirit. But when messages become trapped in the language of defeat, something different happens. The mind begins to rehearse helplessness rather than hope. And that is precisely the kind of environment where doubt thrives. The enemy understands this dynamic extremely well. He understands that if he can influence the language people repeat every day, he can slowly reshape how they see the world. He doesn't need dramatic attacks if he can quietly distort the narrative running inside a believer's mind, because the narrative determines the direction of the soul. This is why discernment matters so much. Christians must learn to ask deeper questions about the messages they allow into their hearts. Not every popular idea reflects biblical truth. Not every emotional experience leads to spiritual growth. The standard must always be this: does this message strengthen trust in God, or does it reinforce a mindset of fear and defeat? That question alone can transform how we listen, how we speak, and how we worship. And when believers become intentional about the words they repeat, when they choose messages rooted in truth, hope, and the character of God, they begin to reshape their inner world. Faith grows stronger, perspective becomes clearer, and the subtle strategies of the enemy lose their power, because in the end, the battle for the human soul often begins with something deceptively simple. The words we choose to sing expand key point 2 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative yet accessible, mirroring Jordan Peterson's approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights share. Once you begin to understand the power of words and the role they play in shaping our inner world, the next thing that becomes clear is that deception rarely arrives in an obvious form. In fact, if you study both human psychology and the biblical narrative, you'll notice something remarkably consistent. The most dangerous lies are almost always mixed with a small amount of truth. That's what makes them believable. The strategy of the enemy has never primarily been brute force. It's not usually about overwhelming people with something clearly evil. That would provoke resistance immediately. Instead, deception works through subtle distortions, tiny shifts in meaning that slowly redirect the mind away from what is true. In psychological terms, you could say that the enemy operates through cognitive manipulation. He doesn't necessarily remove truth entirely. He bends it, and once truth is bent, perception follows. You can see this pattern right from the beginning of the biblical story. The first temptation was not a direct command to rebel, it was a question, a suggestion, a reframing of reality. Did God really say? That question introduced doubt. And doubt, once planted, begins to grow if it is not confronted with clarity. Now that dynamic hasn't changed. It shows up today in far more sophisticated ways, particularly through culture, media, and the messages that constantly surround us. Ideas move through music, entertainment, conversations, and social trends, and most people absorb them without ever examining the deeper assumptions behind them. But ideas are never neutral. Every message carries a worldview, whether people recognize it or not. It contains assumptions about suffering, responsibility, meaning, identity, and hope. When you listen closely to the messages that circulate widely in culture, you'll often notice a subtle pattern. Many of them emphasize victimhood without redemption, despair without transformation, or self-focus without responsibility. Now, psychologically, those messages are extremely powerful because they resonate with human emotion. They tap into pain, disappointment, and frustration, experiences everyone has felt at some point. And because the emotional tone feels authentic, people assume the message itself must also be healthy or truthful. But authenticity of emotion does not automatically equal truth. That's one of the great confusions of modern thinking. People have come to believe that if something feels emotionally honest, then it must be spiritually beneficial. Yet Scripture repeatedly warns that the heart itself can be misleading if it is not guided by truth. So the enemy often works through messages that sound sympathetic but subtly remove hope. They normalize despair. They reinforce the idea that circumstances define destiny. And over time, if a person continually absorbs those messages, they begin to interpret their own life through that same lens. It's a slow shift, but a profound one. Psychologically speaking, what happens is that a person's interpretive framework begins to change. Instead of viewing challenges as opportunities for faith and growth, they begin to see them as confirmation that life is fundamentally unfair and hopeless. That interpretation drains motivation, weakens resilience, and gradually erodes spiritual confidence. And knees a person loses confidence in God's goodness or sovereignty. The enemy doesn't have to do much more. the internal battle has already been compromised. What's particularly interesting is that this process rarely feels dramatic. It's incremental. People don't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their faith. Instead, they slowly absorb messages that reshape their expectations about life and about God. The shift happens quietly, almost invisibly, until eventually their outlook no longer resembles the hopeful confidence described in Scripture. That's why discernment is so essential. Discernment means learning to look beneath the surface of a message and ask deeper questions. What vision of reality does this idea promote? What does it suggest about suffering, responsibility, or redemption? Does it point toward trust in God, or does it encourage a posture of resignation and defeat? Those questions matter because the human mind is extraordinarily receptive to repeated ideas. If a message aligns with fear, resentment, or cynicism, and it is repeated often enough, it will eventually begin to feel like the most realistic way to interpret life. But realism without hope is not wisdom. It's despair disguised as insight. Biblical faith has always offered something radically different. It acknowledges suffering honestly, but it refuses to let suffering have the final word. It insists that meaning can emerge even from chaos, that redemption is possible, and that God remains active even in circumstances that appear dark or confusing. That perspective doesn't deny pain. It transforms how pain is understood. And that transforms how pain is understood. And that transforms is precisely what deception tries to prevent. Because if believers lose sight of God's redemptive power, their faith becomes fragile. They begin to operate from fear rather than trust. And once fear dominates the inner narrative, the enemy's why, work becomes much easier. Which is why the responsibility ultimately falls on each individual believer to guard the ideas they allow into their minds, not with paranoia but with thoughtful awareness. Because the battle for belief is rarely fought through dramatic confrontations. It is fought quietly through the messages people absorb every single day. And the truth is this: a lie doesn't have to shout to reshape your life. It only has to whisper often enough that you stop questioning it. Expand key point 3 into a 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Jordan Peterson's approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. Once you begin to recognize how subtle deception operates, another question naturally emerges. If these messages can be spiritually harmful, if they quietly distort our perception of reality, then why do so many believers continue repeating them? Why do Christians keep singing ideas that ultimately weaken their faith rather than strengthen it? The answer in large part lies in something deeply human. Familiarity. Human beings are creatures of habit. Psychologically speaking, we are drawn toward what feels known and emotionally comfortable. When an idea becomes familiar, it begins to feel safe. And when something feels safe, we rarely question it. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms shaping belief systems. Repetition breeds acceptance. You see it everywhere in etch. Human culture. Ideas that are repeated often enough begin to feel self-evident. People stop asking whether those ideas are actually true because they have become part of the cultural background, like air in the room. You don't notice it anymore. The same dynamic occurs in spiritual environments. When a message is repeated in churches, in music, or in religious conversations, believers can begin to assume that it must be spiritually sound. After all, if everyone around them accepts it, then it must be correct. That assumption is understandable, but it's also dangerous, because popularity has never been a reliable indicator of truth. History demonstrates that quite clearly. Entire societies have embraced ideas that were profoundly destructive simply because those ideas were widely accepted. Once something becomes normalized, people often lose the ability, or perhaps the courage, to examine it critically. Now think about how this applies to worship and spiritual messaging, music especially. has an extraordinary ability to bypass our analytical thinking. It connects directly to emotion and memory. When a song resonates emotionally, people tend to focus on how it feels rather than what it communicates. But emotional resonance is not the same as spiritual accuracy. A song can feel deeply moving while still reinforcing a worldview that subtly undermines faith. It might emphasize despair without redemption. It might center entirely on human weakness without pointing toward God's power. And because the emotional experience feels authentic, people assume the message itself must also be healthy. This is where psychological attachment enters the picture. When believers associate certain songs or messages with meaningful moments in their lives, moments of comfort, nostalgia, or community, they develop emotional loyalty to those expressions. The message becomes tied to memory and relationships. Questioning the message then begins to feel almost like questioning the experience itself. So people avoid examining it. They keep repeating the words, keep singing the lyrics, and keep reinforcing the ideas without ever pausing to ask whether those ideas align with the deeper truth of Scripture. Over time, the message becomes embedded in the collective consciousness of the community. And once that happens, challenging it becomes even more difficult. There is also another psychological factor at work: social conformity. Human beings are highly sensitive to the expectations of their group. We want to belong. We want to avoid conflict. So when a message becomes widely accepted within a community, individuals often hesitate to question it, even if something about it feels slightly off. It's easier to go along with the crowd than to raise uncomfortable questions. But spiritual maturity requires precisely that kind of courage. It requires the willingness to examine familiar patterns and ask whether they truly reflect the character of God. That process isn't about criticism for its own sake. It's about clarity. It's about ensuring that the messages shaping our hearts are actually leading us toward truth rather than away from it. And this is where the biblical call to discernment becomes so relevant. Discernment means developing the ability to evaluate ideas thoughtfully rather than absorbing them passively. It means recognizing that even well-intentioned communities can sometimes adopt messages that subtly distort reality, because sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. Many people repeat ideas not because they are malicious or careless, but because they simply inherited those ideas from the culture around them. They learned them through repetition. And once something becomes part of your internal narrative, it can be surprisingly difficult to start, unpack, and evaluate it objectively. But growth requires exactly that step. It requires the humility to admit that familiarity does not equal truth, and that emotional comfort does not always lead to spiritual strength. Sometimes the most faithful thing a believer can do is pause and ask difficult questions about the messages they have accepted without reflection. What am I actually reinforcing when I repeat these words? What vision of God does this message present? Does it strengthen trust, courage, and hope, or does it quietly reinforce fear and defeat? Those questions can be transformative, because once people begin examining the messages shaping their minds, they regain something essential: responsibility for their inner narrative. They stop being passive recipients of cultural ideas and become intentional participants in their own spiritual formation. And that shift changes everything. Because the reality is this: the ideas you repeat today will shape the person you become tomorrow. So the real question every believer must confront is simple but profound. Are the words you keep singing leading you toward truth or merely toward familiarity? Expand key point 4 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Jordan Peterson's approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared once you begin to understand how subtle messages shape belief and why people continue repeating them. The nay XT thing we have to confront is the consequence of that pattern. Because ideas are not harmless decorations in the mind. They are organizing forces. They structure perception, emotion, and behavior. And when the wrong ideas are repeated long enough, they begin to reshape a person's inner world in ways that are both psychological and spiritual. What we repeatedly say, sing, and internalize gradually becomes the architecture of our thinking. Human beings interpret reality through internal narratives. Every person carries a story about who they are, what the world is like, and whether the future holds hope or despair. That narrative operates quietly in the background of consciousness, but it influences nearly every decision we make. If the narrative is grounded in truth, responsibility, and hope, it creates resilience. It allows people to endure difficulty without collapsing into hopelessness. But if the narrative becomes saturated with defeat, helplessness, and pessimism, something different happens. The mind begins to filter reality through that lens. Challenges that could have been interpreted as temporary obstacles start to look like permanent evidence that life is fundamentally unfair. Pain begins to feel meaningless. Effort begins to feel pointless. And over time, that perspective drains the energy required to act with courage and faith. Psychologists sometimes describe this phenomenon as learned helplessness. When individuals repeatedly encounter messages suggesting that they have little power, little hope, and little possibility of change, they begin to believe it even when opportunities for growth still exist. The belief itself becomes a barrier stronger than the obstacle. Now think about the spiritual implications of that dynamic. If a believer constantly absorbs messages that reinforce defeat, those messages slowly reshape how that person sees God. God begins to appear distant rather than present. His promises begin to feel abstract rather than reliable. Faith becomes something theoretical rather than something active and transformative. And once that shift occurs internally, the external life follows, because belief determines behavior. A person who believes that change is possible will act differently than someone who believes nothing will improve. The first person moves forward with courage, even in uncertainty. The second person withdraws, hesitates, and eventually stops trying. The difference between those two outcomes is not always the circumstance. It is the story the person believes about the circumstance. That is why spiritual messages carry so much weight. Every message we repeat is quietly reinforcing a worldview. It is telling us something about suffering, something about hope, and something about the role God plays in the chaos of human life. If the message consistently emphasizes despair without redemption, then the mind begins to assume redemption is unlikely. Over time, that assumption weakens faith. And here's the tragedy. The individual may not even realize why their spiritual life feels fragile. They might still attend church. They might still pray occasionally. But internally, the sense of confidence in God's power has eroded. Their expectations about life have shifted downward. They begin to anticipate disappointment rather than deliverance. That shift is subtle, but it is incredibly significant because faith at its core involves trust in a reality greater than immediate circumstances. It involves a belief that meaning can emerge from suffering and that God remains active even when the situation appears chaotic. When that belief weakens, the individual's psychological stability often weakens with it. The enemy understands this very well. He doesn't need to eliminate faith entirely. If he can gradually dilute it, if he can replace confidence with quiet cynicism, hope with quiet resignation, then the believer becomes spiritually passive. And spiritual passivity is fertile ground for deeper discouragement. But the pattern doesn't stop there. Messages that emphasize defeat also influence how people see themselves. Instead of recognizing their responsibility and capacity for growth, individuals may begin to define themselves primarily through their wounds or limitations. Identity becomes rooted in brokenness rather than transformation. Now, acknowledging brokenness is important. No honest spiritual life denies the reality of human weakness, but the biblical narrative never ends with weakness. It moves toward restoration. It insists that transformation is possible because God is active within the process. That forward movement is essential for psychological health. When people lose sight of the possibility of transformation, they lose motivation. They stop striving for growth because they no longer believe growth will matter, and that stagnation gradually erodes both character and faith. So the consequences of repeated messages are not trivial. They shape expectations about life, about God, and about the self. They either strengthen the internal foundation of hope or they slowly undermine it, and this is why believers must take the formation of their inner world seriously. What you repeatedly allow into your mind will eventually define the boundaries of your faith. The ideas you rehearse today will shape the person you become tomorrow. They will influence whether you approach life with courage or retreat into quiet despair. That responsibility cannot be avoided. Because whether you realize it or not, every message you repeat is constructing the spiritual environment in which your faith must live. And the question that remains is both simple. E in profound, profound. Are the words shaping your mind, building strength, or quietly teaching your soul to surrender? Expand key point 5 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Jordan Peterson's approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. If you begin to understand the consequences of the messages we repeat, how they quietly shape perception, weaken faith, and restructure the inner narrative, then the natural question becomes this: what do we do about it? Recognizing a problem is important, but recognition alone does not transform the mind. Something deeper has to occur. There must be a deliberate replacement of false narratives with truthful ones, and that idea is actually central to both psychology and scripture. The human mind does not simply remove ideas, it replaces them. If you attempt to eliminate a destructive thought pattern without introducing something stronger and more meaningful in its place, the old pattern almost inevitably returns. The brain tends to fall back into the grooves that have been carved through repetition. Those grooves, those familiar mental pathways, are powerful. So transformation requires intentional redirection. In the biblical language, this process is often described as the renewal of the mind. That phrase is not merely poetic. It describes a very real psychological phenomenon. To renew the mind means to consciously restructure the narratives and assumptions through which you interpret life. It means replacing ideas that produce fear and defeat with ideas rooted in truth and hope. Now, that may sound simple, but it is not automatic. It requires attention and discipline, because the world constantly offers competing narratives, messages that encourage resentment, self-pity, or despair are everywhere. They move through culture almost invisibly, embedded in entertainment, conversations, and social media. If a person does nothing intentionally to counter those messages, they will eventually absorb them by default. And once absorbed, those ideas begin shaping emotional responses. That is why spiritual practices exist. Prayer, scripture, and worship are not merely religious rituals meant to satisfy a sense of obligation. They are mechanisms designed to reorient the mind toward truth. They provide a consistent reminder that the world is larger than immediate circumstances and that God's character remains stable even when life feels unstable. Think about the psychological power of that idea. If a person continually focuses on the chaos of the world without anchoring their mind in something higher, anxiety becomes almost inevitable. The human mind was not designed to carry the weight of ultimate control. When people assume, even unconsciously, that everything depends on their own understanding or ability to manage events, the result is chronic fear. But when the mind is anchored in the reality of God's sovereignty, something remarkable happens. Perspective expands. Problems are still real, but they are no longer ultimate. They exist within a larger framework of meaning. And meaning is what gives human beings the strength to endure difficulty. This is why the messages we repeat must consistently direct our attention toward truth rather than toward despair. Worship that focuses on God's faithfulness does more than inspire emotion. It stabilizes the mind. Scripture that reminds believers of God's promises does more than provide comfort. It restructures perception. Over time, those truths begin to form a different internal narrative. Instead of interpreting challenges as proof that life is hopeless, the believer begins to see them as part of a larger process of growth and refinement. Instead of assuming that suffering cancels meaning, they begin to see how meaning can emerge through perseverance and trust. That shift in perspective changes everything. Because courage is not the absence of difficulty. Courage emerges when a person believes that difficulty itself can serve a purpose. Faith operates in a similar way. It is not blind optimism. It is confidence that God remains active even when outcomes are uncertain. And that confidence must be reinforced repeatedly. Just as harmful messages reshape the mind through repetition, truthful messages must also be repeated until they become the new foundation of perception. The process is gradual. It unfolds over days, months, and years of consistently choosing what to focus on. But eventually something remarkable happens. The inner narrative begins to change. The mind becomes less vulnerable to despair because it has been trained to return to truth. Challenges still appear, but they no longer dominate the psychological landscape. The individual develops resilience, a quiet, steady confidence that circumstances do not have the final word. And that is precisely what the enemy tries to prevent. Because a believer whose mind is anchored in truth is difficult to destabilize, fear loses much of its power, doubt loses its persuasive voice. The person becomes capable of moving forward even when the path is uncertain. That kind of faith is not accidental. It is cultivated. It grows when individuals intentionally fill their minds with messages that reflect God's character, His strength, His faithfulness, His ability to redeem even the most broken situations. Those truths reshape the imagination. They create a spiritual environment where hope becomes stronger than fear. And that environment transforms how a person lives. Because once the mind is aligned with truth, the individual is no longer merely reacting to the chaos of the world. They begin acting with purpose, with courage, and with clarity about what ultimately matters. Which leads to a simple but profound responsibility. Every day, you are choosing the ideas that will shape your mind. You are deciding which messages will define your inner narrative and which ones you will reject, and the future of your faith may depend on that decision. Because the mind you build today will determine the strength of the life you face tomorrow. Expand key points 6 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Jordan Peterson's approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights. Share. If you follow this line of thinking all the way to its logical conclusion, you arrive at a very personal and unavoidable responsibility. Because once you understand that words shape the mind, that subtle messages can distort perception, and that repeated ideas gradually construct the inner narrative through which you interpret life, then a question emerges that no believer can escape. What are you choosing to allow into your heart? Of that question matters more than most people realize. Human beings are constantly absorbing information through music, conversations, media, and the countless messages circulating through culture every day. Most of that absorption happens unconsciously. We hear things, repeat things, and internalize things without ever stopping to examine their deeper implications, but the mind does not remain neutral while this happens. It is always organizing those ideas into a framework. That framework becomes the lens through which we see God, ourselves, and the future. So eventually every person must decide whether they will live passively, allowing culture to shape that framework, or whether they will become intentional about what they allow to influence their inner world. And that distinction is crucial, because spiritual maturity is not merely about attending church or agreeing with certain doctrines. It involves the active formation of the mind and heart. It requires discernment, which simply means the ability to evaluate ideas carefully and determine whether they align with truth. Discernment is not cynicism. It is clarity. It asks questions that many people prefer to avoid. When you hear a message, when you sing a song, when you repeat certain phrases, discernment quietly asks, what does this idea suggest about God? What does it imply about hope, responsibility, and the possibility of transformation? Those questions are not meant to make life more complicated. They are meant to protect the integrity of your faith, because every message carries an implicit worldview. Some messages reinforce the belief that God is faithful even in difficulty. Others subtly imply that life is governed primarily by chaos and disappointment. Some encourage courage and responsibility. Others normalize resignation and passivity. And whichever messages dominate your me and will eventually shape the person you become, that is not merely a spiritual observation. It is a psychological one as well. The human brain adapts to what it repeatedly experiences. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. If a person continually exposes themselves to ideas rooted in truth, hope, and meaning, those ideas gradually become the default pattern of thought. But the reverse is also true. If someone repeatedly immerses themselves in messages that emphasize despair, cynicism, or defeat, those ideas slowly become the framework through which they interpret every challenge they encounter. The world begins to look darker than it actually is. Opportunities for growth begin to feel pointless. And the tragedy is that this shift often happens so gradually that people barely notice it. That is why intentional worship matters so much. Worship is not merely about music or emotion. It is about orientation. It is about orientation. It directs the mind toward the character of God, toward His power, His faithfulness, His capacity to redeem broken situations. When believers engage in worship that reflects those truths, something powerful happens internally. The mind realigns with reality as Scripture describes it. Fear loses some of its influence because the focus shifts towards something greater than immediate circumstances. And that shift restores perspective. Because the central claim of the Christian faith is not that life will be easy, it is that God remains sovereign even in the midst of difficulty. It is the belief that suffering does not cancel meaning and that darkness does not have the final word. Those truths create resilience. A person who deeply internalizes them approaches life differently. Challenges do not disappear, but they are no longer interpreted as proof that hope is futile. Instead, they become opportunities to trust more deeply, to grow stronger in character, and to witness the quiet ways God works through adversity. That perspective does not emerge automatically. It is cultivated through deliberate choices about what you allow into your mind and heart. You decide what voices will influence you. You decide which messages you will repeat until they shake your perception of reality. And ultimately, you decide whether the words you sing will strengthen your faith or slowly erode it. That decision carries enormous weight because the inner narrative you build will guide your actions when life becomes difficult. When uncertainty arrives, and it always does, the mind falls back on whatever foundation has been constructed through repetition. If that foundation is built on fear, discouragement quickly takes control. But if it is built on truth, faith becomes remarkably durable, and that is the real challenge facing every believer, not simply to participate in religious activity, but to guard the formation of the inner world where belief actually lives. Because the battle for faith is rarely fought in dramatic moments. It is fought quietly, in the everyday choices about which words you allow to echo through your mind, so choose them carefully.